The V-Thrani Apex reader walked in at 6:14, 2 hours before the session was scheduled, and stopped 3 meters inside the door. Miso was on the table. Not in his carrier. On the actual treaty table, the long oval of brushed solennale that the station facilities crew had spent the better part of a week polishing to a standard, the V-Thrani Protocol Office had submitted 16 pages of requirements for. He had found the one patch of morning light coming through the observation port, turned twice, and settled. He was asleep before the apex reader's second foot cleared the threshold. I was at the side console running the morning comms queue. I had a cup of station coffee going cold at my elbow, and a revised materials annex on my screen that I needed to annotate before the 800 briefing. I looked up when the door opened because that is what you do when a door opens. I noted that it was Parith Sewell, the apex reader, the one they had flagged in the delegation manifest as a specialist, purpose not further specified, and I returned to the annex. I heard Parith Sewell stop. I heard the particular stillness that follows a stop that is not a pause. I said without looking up, "He won't bite, he's 9. Parith Sewell did not answer. I annotated 2 more clauses. When I looked up again, Parith Sewell was still standing in the same position, facing the table and both of the secondary eyes. The small lateral pair the V-Thrani use for environmental scanning, different function from the primary pair, I had been told, not vision exactly, more like pressure sense, were open fully. That was unusual. In my 12 years on the V-Thrani desk, I had seen that particular posture twice before. Once when a V-Thrani commander walked into a room where a compact security team had a Ketharan breach unit at low ready, and once when a junior attaché from the V-Thrani mission had misread a protocol and accidentally declared himself in formal challenge to a second-tier elder. Both times, the V-Thrani in question had gone very still and done their threat assessment math, which takes them approximately 4 seconds, and involves a sequence of micro-expressions I had learned to read well enough to distinguish calculating from decided. Parith Sewell was calculating. Miso made the small sound he makes when sunlight hits him at a good angle. It is not quite a purr. It is lower than that, more intermittent, like something running very smoothly in a warm engine room. I picked up my coffee cup and walked to the table. "Parith Sewell," I said, "good morning. The session prep materials are at the north end of the table. Miso has the south end." Parith Sewell's primary eyes tracked to me. The secondary eyes did not move. "The animal," Parith Sewell said. "The V-Thrani use a tonal identifier for species they have not formally classified, a rising inflection on the word before the noun, something between a question and a category marker. They had used it when they first encountered horses. They had used it when they first encountered the Ketharan silkworms that the agricultural delegation brought to the framework secondary sessions. They used it now." "His name is Miso," I said. "He's a domestic cat, Felis catus, Earth origin. He has been at every posting I've had for the last 9 years. "It is on the table." "He is, yes." I considered the cup, decided against finishing it. He found the light. Parith Sewell was quiet. The secondary eyes were still open. I had the impression, not unusual when working with the V-Thrani, that a very long internal conversation was happening at considerable speed, and that I was only seeing the last few seconds of it. "I will note this," Parith Sewell said and left. I moved Miso to the carrier gently and went back to the annex. He was back on the table by 6:40. I let him stay. The V-Thrani contact record begins, depending on which authority you cite, either at the Kesrath survey of 2031 or at the first formal exchange of position papers in 2041. The Compact's diplomatic corps uses 2041 as the working baseline, which means that by the time Reach Station Solen hosted the V-Thrani precession for the Kelvarath corridor negotiations, the contact record was just over 600 years old. In that time, the V-Thrani had concluded 47 bilateral agreements, 9 compact-wide accords, and 14 joint operational frameworks. They had walked away from 6 negotiations. They had won, in the sense of extracting better terms than the counterparty's initial position, every single negotiation they had completed. I do not say this to be discouraging. I say it because it is the context into which Miso walked, or more accurately, into which Miso was transported in a soft-sided carrier with a broken zipper that I had been meaning to replace for 3 years. The Kelvarath corridor was a contested transit zone roughly the size of a modest solar system, notable primarily for its navigational value and secondarily for a resource survey that 3 different parties were currently disputing. The Vithrani had a claim. The Compact had a claim. The Kelvarath themselves, the 4th party, whose corridor it nominally was, had a claim that was legally sound and practically ignored by everyone including their own negotiating team, who had accepted compact transport to the station and were generally thought to be leaning toward our position. The Vithrani knew this. They were not pleased about it. The precession was, therefore, not a casual meeting. My role was specific. I was the Compact's senior human liaison to the Vithrani desk, which meant I was the person the Vithrani were used to dealing with, the person whose communication patterns they had built 12 years of predictive models around, and the person who, in the assessment of my director, was most likely to be able to read the room before something went wrong. It was not the most glamorous job in the diplomatic corps. It was, arguably, the most important one at this table. I had been on Reach Station Solène for 6 days before the delegation arrived. Miso had been with me for all 6. He had investigated the cabin thoroughly on day 1, determined that the bunk ledge and the space under the console had the best thermal profiles, and settled into a routine without consulting me about it. He ate at 700 and 1800. He used the travel box I kept in the corner. He sat on my lap during the morning comms queue, and was indifferent to my lap during the evening review, preferring instead to press his spine against the warm side of the console housing, and purr at a frequency that I had measured once, out of idle curiosity, and found was approximately 28 Hz, which the vet on my previous posting had said was the lower boundary of the therapeutic resonance range, without specifying therapeutic for whom. He had been doing all of this for 9 years. There was a carrier with his name on the manifest at every station I had ever been posted to. The admin staff at the Compact's diplomatic division had a note in my file that said, simply, "Travels with Cat," which apparently served as sufficient explanation for any accommodation-related questions that came up during posting assignment. He weighed 4.5 kilos. He had a vertical scar on his left ear from a dispute with a radiator when he was a kitten. His fur was orange and cream in a pattern the vet had described as classic mackerel tabby, which I had taken as a compliment on his behalf. His eyes were the particular yellow-green that reads, in low light, as simply yellow, and in daylight as something closer to amber. He had, in 9 years of postings, sat on 7 treaty documents, slept through 4 emergency comms alerts, and been listed on the manifest of every major negotiation I had handled since the Vorth bilateral. I had not thought, when I accepted the Kelvarath posting, that any of this would be relevant to the outcome. The Vithrani delegation arrived at 800 precisely, which was itself a statement. The Vithrani are not punctual as a courtesy. They are punctual as a tactic. Arriving exactly on time communicates that they have assessed your schedule, found it acceptable, and chosen to honor it, which positions the honoring as a gift rather than a mutual arrangement. 12 years had made me fluent in the grammar of this. There were 7 of them. Lead negotiator Kesavarthen, whom I had worked with before on the secondary annex to the 4th Compact framework, and who had beaten us on 4 of 6 contested points in that session. 2 senior advisors whose names I had memorized from the brief. The protocol officer, Vithrak Senin, whose job was to ensure the proceedings conformed to the full stack of Vithrani formal requirements, all of which had been pre-submitted and all of which I had read. 2 document aides. And Parathsul. The V-Thrani do not typically bring Apex readers to pre-sessions. An Apex reader is, as best as I understood the role, a specialist in biological threat assessment, a deep reader of ambient biological signatures in the way that a signals officer reads electronic ones. They are used in military contexts, in first contact situations, and occasionally in high-stakes diplomatic settings when the V-Thrani are concerned that the other party may have brought a capability that is not formally represented in the manifest. The logic is straightforward. What you cannot classify, you cannot plan against. What you cannot plan against, you cannot negotiate from a position of certainty. The V-Thrani prefer certainty. I had flagged Parith Sewell's name to my director when I saw it on the delegation list. My director had said it was unusual but not unprecedented, and that I should proceed normally. I had proceeded normally, which meant I had thought about it for 3 more days and decided I could not account for it and moved on. Kesavarthen entered the antechamber, took in the room in the way that Kesavarthen takes in every room, a single slow visual pass, left to right, that misses nothing and acknowledges nothing, and then stopped for approximately 1 second on the table. Miso was on the table again. He had moved from his carrier during my 740 communications check and relocated to the south end of the treaty surface, where he had arranged himself in the compact loaf position he uses when he is not fully asleep but does not intend to move. His eyes were half open. He was looking at the observation port. Kesavarthen looked at me. "Good morning," I said. "Liaison Veth, compact diplomatic corps, as you know. The materials for the pre-session are at the north end of the table. Water and V-Thrani standard refreshment are on the side console. The session will begin when your delegation is ready." "Your animal is on the treaty table," Kesavarthen said. "He is," I said. "He likes the surface. If it causes a problem, I can move him." I said this the way I would say that I could move a plant or reposition a chair. It is a legitimate offer and it carries no apology, because there is nothing to apologize for. The V-Thrani read apology as weakness in the same way they read it in most of the species they have encountered, and I had learned early that every word in a conversation with Kesavarthen was also a position paper. Kesavarthen was quiet for a moment. Then, "It will not be necessary." The delegation took their seats. Parith Sewell, I noted, did not sit. Parith Sewell took a standing position near the wall to the right of the delegation's primary chairs, not where I had placed the observer's station in the room plan, but a position that gave a direct sightline to the full length of the table. I noted the position and said nothing. I took my seat at the compact side. My assistant liaison, Torvin Rask, second-year attaché, very good with treaty language, visibly taught in the way that people are when they have done their preparation and are now waiting for something to happen, was already in his chair. The Kelvarath representative, Advisor Orath, was present as the third party, seated at the short end of the table in the observer's position. The Kelvarath have 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal band, amber irised, and all 4 of them made a quiet pass around the room before settling. I saw Orath's gaze find Miso, and stopped there for a moment longer than the rest of the room. Before I could open my notes, the V-Thrani protocol officer, Vithraxenin, stepped forward from the delegation side. Vithraxenin was a thin, precise individual whose entire professional purpose was the enforcement of procedural correctness, and the expression on their face said clearly that a procedural issue had been identified and was about to be raised. "Liaison Veth," Vithraxenin said. "The station manifest for this session lists 1 human diplomatic principal, 1 human assistant, and 1 Kelvarath observer. It does not list an additional biological entity. The manifest also includes the supplemental administrative attachments," I said. "Attachment 4 covers accompanying personal effects and registered companion animals. Miso is listed there, as he has been on every manifest at every posting for 9 years. Vithraxenin was carrying a document, and they looked at it. There was a pause that I recognized as the pause of someone who has found the reference document and is now determining whether its contents satisfy the objection or merely reframe it. The category in Attachment 4, Vithrexenin said, is classified under personal effects, non-hazardous biological companions. The Vithrani session protocol requires that all biological entities present in the negotiating space be classified to the satisfaction of the Vithrani delegation's protocol officer prior to the opening of formal proceedings. I understand, I said. Miso is a domestic cat. Felis catus, Earth origin, 9 years of age, companion animal classification under compact biological taxonomy. He is not a working animal, not a security animal, not a diplomatic resource. He is my pet. He accompanies me to all postings. His classification in the compact record is companion fauna domestic subspecies. Vithrexenin made a notation, looked at Miso, looked at the notation. There was another pause of the same kind, the data fitting the category, but something at the edge of the category not entirely settling. The protocol requires formal acknowledgement by the lead negotiator, Vithrexenin said. Ambassador Kesavarthen, do you accept the stated classification of the compact representatives accompanying companion fauna for purposes of this session? Kesavarthen looked at Miso. The look lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which was, for Kesavarthen, a considered pause. The classification is noted, Kesavarthen said. We may proceed. Vithrexenin made a final notation and returned to their position. I had the impression. It was not more than an impression. I was watching Kesavarthen and not Vithrexenin, that the protocol officer was not entirely satisfied, in the way that people are not satisfied when a form has been correctly completed but the underlying situation remains. In some way they cannot precisely articulate, irregular. I opened my notes and said, shall we begin? The Vithrani opened negotiations by establishing what they call the ground of encounter, which is a formal statement of what each party understands to be true, undisputed about the subject at hand. It is not a statement of positions. It is a statement of facts. The purpose, as near as I could tell after 12 years of watching it, is twofold. To surface any factual disputes that need resolution before positions are even declared, and to establish, in the early minutes, which party is more in command of the factual record. The party that knows more, and states it more precisely, has already won something before the first contested point is raised. Kesavarthen delivered the Vithrani ground of encounter statement. It was precise, thorough, and correct. It was also, in 3 specific places, framed in a way that subtly foregrounded the Vithrani survey data over the compacts, not inaccurately, but selectively, in the way that a map can be perfectly accurate and still show you the territory from a particular angle. I noted the 3 framings and did not object, because objecting during a ground of encounter exchange is a protocol violation that would cost more than the 3 framings were worth. I delivered the compact statement. I had prepared it carefully. I delivered it in the same register in which Kesavarthen had delivered theirs, flat, factual, without editorial inflection. I did not correct the 3 framings. I simply stated the compact's factual record with equal precision and noted, in passing, the date of the compact's primary corridor survey. The date was 18 months earlier than the Vithrani survey. In a corridor rights dispute, 18 months of documented prior presence is not a minor point. Kesavarthen heard it, did not react, filed it. During this entire exchange, Miso got up, stretched, the full stretch he does after sleeping, front paws extended to full reach, spine arched, back legs pushing, walked 4 unhurried steps to the center of the table, turned once, and lay down directly on top of Kesavarthen's prepared position document. The room did not stop, but it almost did. Kesavarthen looked at Miso, then at me. I was still delivering the final clause of the ground of encounter statement. I finished the clause. I looked up. Apologies, I said, in the same tone I had been using throughout. He does this. I reached across and lifted Miso from the document. He allowed this with the tolerance of someone who has accepted, after long experience, that the humans around him have particular priorities. I placed him back at the south end of the table. He considered the situation for approximately 2 seconds and then lay down again in the same position. The position document had a warm orange-furred indent in it. Kesavarthen looked at the indent, said nothing. "Shall I continue?" I asked. Kesavarthen said, after a pause of perhaps 3 seconds long, "For Kesavarthen, please." I continued. Behind me, I heard the sound of Torvin very carefully not moving in his chair. The positional statements began at 8:20. I had been in enough V-Thrani format sessions to know the early architecture. They establish their strongest factual claim in the first movement, follow it with the operational history that demonstrates continuity of presence, and close the opening with the legal instrument they prefer to apply. The sequence is designed to make the counterparty feel like the conversation is already decided before any actual negotiation begins. The first time I faced it, 12 years ago, I had made the mistake of trying to rebut each point as it was raised. Kesavarthen, at that time, had been polite about it. I no longer tried to rebut during the opening. I listened, noted, and waited. At 8:35, Vithraxenin, still in the protocol officer's standing position along the near wall, produced a secondary instrument unit and pointed it, without comment, at the center of the table where Miso was lying. The unit was smaller than Parathsul's, formatted differently with a simpler readout. Vithraxenin looked at the readout, made a notation, looked at the readout again. Kesavarthen, mid-sentence in the operational history section, did not stop, but I saw the fractional pause, the beat where the rhythm of the sentence was maintained, while attention divided briefly, and then Kesavarthen continued without breaking stride. Vithraxenin put the secondary unit away and did not produce it again. I watched this in my peripheral vision and kept my notes in front of me. Miso was asleep. He did not adjust for the instrument. He did not adjust for anything. It was Parathsul who interrupted. We were 20 minutes into Kesavarthen's presentation of the navigational rights claim, the historical use section, detailed and documented, when Parathsul from the wall said, "Liaison veth." An apex reader does not speak during the substantive exchange unless recognized by the lead negotiator. I glanced at Kesavarthen. Kesavarthen's expression, controlled as always, registered that this was not planned. "Yes," I said. "The animal," Parathsul said. "What is its functional designation?" "His name is Miso," I said. "He is a domestic cat. I've given you the species information." "Its functional designation," Parathsul said. "The compact's biological taxonomy for what it does, not the personal identifier." Miso had, at some point in the previous 10 minutes, moved from the south end of the table toward Parathsul's wall position. He had settled into an upright sit at the table's near edge, tail wrapped around his front paws, and was regarding Parathsul with the expression of mild interest he reserves for things that have not yet been fully categorized. His secondary eyes, Parathsul's, I mean, were open. Both pairs. "He's a companion animal," I said. "Companion fauna, domestic subspecies. He's a pet." Parathsul said nothing for a moment. Then Miso yawned fully, unhurriedly, jaw extended to its maximum, the 4 small canine teeth catching the light, and resettled his paws. Parathsul looked at the teeth. "Noted," Parathsul said, and went quiet. Kesavarthen resumed, but I had seen the fractional recalibration in Kesavarthen's posture when Parathsul spoke, and I had seen it again now. A small tightening across the shoulders, the particular stillness that indicates information being processed in real time rather than filed for later. Kesavarthen resumed from 3 points earlier in the navigational rights section, not where they had been interrupted. As if they needed to rerun the calculation, from a different starting point. Torvin passed me a note that said only, Parith Sewell's instrument. I glanced toward the wall. Parith Sewell was holding the dark-cased unit at an angle that kept the indicator panel visible without drawing attention to it. From where I sat, I could see that at least 2 of the indicators were well above midpoint. I wrote back to Torvin. Later he nodded. Advisor Oreth had still not spoken. Per protocol, the third party observes the opening exchanges and does not interject until the positional statements have closed and the substantive negotiation opens. Oreth was following this correctly, but the Kelvarath's 4 eyes were not on the documents. They were on Miso. I had the impression, and I had worked with Kelvarath representatives before, they are not opaque, that Oreth was making their own assessment, and that the assessment was not the one I had expected them to be making at this point in the session. The morning session ran until 1000. During it, Miso migrated from the near table end back toward the center, investigated the seam between the table's 2 structural sections with his nose, found it unsatisfactory, and settled at the midpoint with his chin on his paws facing the observation port. At approximately 9:20, during the Vithrani operational investment argument, his left hind leg twitched in a small, involuntary dream motion. Every Vithrani in the room tracked it simultaneously. The senior advisor making the argument paused, resumed, did not look at the cat again for the remainder of the morning, which I had learned in 12 years was not the same thing as not watching. The break was at 1000, 20-minute recess standard. I stayed at the table and worked through my annotations. Torvin went to get water. The Vithrani delegation moved to the far end of the antechamber in a cluster that was clearly not casual conversation. Tight formation, low voices, the posture the Vithrani use when something in the room has departed from the model they brought to it. Parith Sewell came to the table. I let Parith Sewell come. I did not look up from my notes until Parith Sewell had reached the edge of the table and stopped. Parith Sewell, I said. Liaison Veth. Miso opened his eyes at the sound of footsteps and looked at Parith Sewell with the yellow-green gaze he uses for anything that has caught his attention without triggering any response more than looking. He blinked once, then closed his eyes. My instruments, Parith Sewell said, and then stopped. I waited. With the Vithrani, a mid-sentence stop is not hesitation. It is the signal that what follows has been chosen with precision. My instruments are registering a reading from your animal that I have previously recorded only from compact military units, from working animals in active assignment status, specifically from animals designated for security and defense functions. Another pause. It is registering at a level that exceeds those records. I looked up. Parith Sewell was holding the dark-cased unit with both hands. The indicator panel turned toward me. I did not know the Vithrani calibration system, but numerical scales are numerical scales, and the number at the top indicator was at the ceiling of the display, with a secondary marker beside it, small, formatted differently from the main scale, that I took, from context, to indicate that the scale had already been auto-adjusted upward at some point during the morning. How familiar are you with Earth's fauna? I asked. In the record, Parith Sewell said, I have studied the Compact's biological submission files in full preparation for this assignment. Then you know Earth is a death world. Yes. Miso is from Earth. He is domestic, fully domestic, born in an apartment, 2nd generation from domestic parents, 3rd generation. He has never hunted anything in his life. He eats from a measured portion twice daily and sleeps approximately 16 hours in 24. I let that sit for 2 seconds. He is still from Earth. The domestication is recent, in terms of the evolutionary record. His lineage descends from animals that were apex predators in their ecological niche for roughly 10 million years. The behavioral profile of the domesticated form retains approximately 92% of the functional predator architecture. The aggression is suppressed. The architecture is not. Parathul processed this without speaking. To give you a sense of scale, I continued, a domestic cat's sensory range is calibrated for pursuit predation. Hearing range extends to 65 kilohertz, significantly above what humans register, above what most of the species at this station register. Vision is adapted for movement detection at distance and near-dark function. Reaction time is in the range of 70 to 80 milliseconds, which is faster than human visual processing can fully track. I looked at Miso. He is currently in a resting position. All of that is still present. It does not turn off when he lies down. The managed feeding, Parathul said, the enclosed environment, the 9 years of domestic ownership, these have not altered the underlying profile. The behavior changes. The architecture doesn't. I set my coffee cup down. Earth's death world classification is not a function of the large fauna alone, the predators that are obviously dangerous by size. It is a function of the integrated system. Every organism on Earth has been subject to continuous predation pressure across hundreds of millions of years of uninterrupted evolutionary history. Everything that survived developed the appropriate countermeasures. Miso's countermeasures are not turned off. He simply doesn't use them against me. The distinction being, Parathul said, the distinction being that the capability is present and functional. It is in a state of choice, not in a state of absence. I looked at the instrument in Parathul's hands. Your instrument is apparently reading the capability, not the behavior. Parathul looked at the instrument, looked at Miso. Miso, at this particular moment, was performing the slow blink, both eyes closing to a half squint and reopening at half speed. The vet on my previous posting had called it a cat's trust signal, a cat kiss. I had not passed this along to Parathul. The level of this reading, Parathul said carefully, corresponds to what this instrument class would designate a primary apex organism, Tier 1 registration. The instrument is designed to register to Tier 1. It is not designed to register above Tier 1. We both looked at the indicator. It is registering above Tier 1, Parathul said. Miso flexed, not dramatically, the small paw extension he does before settling deeper. He spread each toe in sequence and retracted slowly, and then his paw was flat again on the brushed solennale. Parathul watched the paw. Retractable claws, Parathul said. Fully functional, I said. He uses them on the scratching post I keep in the cabin. I've had to replace it twice. A fully functional primary weapon system, Parathul said, on an organism registering above Tier 1, in a relaxed state, in a room where a formal negotiation is in progress. He's comfortable, I said. He found the light this morning and the surface is warm. He doesn't know anything about the Kelvarath corridor. Parathul processed this for a moment. The secondary eyes had not closed. He is not paying attention, Parathul said slowly, to the negotiation. No, he's asleep. He is asleep, Parathul repeated, in the tone of someone verifying a datum that the instrument is insisting on despite it making no immediate sense. He sleeps a great deal, I said. He's 9. Parathul was quiet for a long time. Then, your previous postings, the Vithrani desk, you said he has been present at all of them. Every posting for 9 years. The Vorath Bilateral, both Kelvarath Framework sessions, the Deep Transit Accord, the 4th Compact Framework. I looked at Parathul. He was in his carrier under my table at all of them or on the table. He went where I went. At the 4th Compact Framework, Parathul said, where the Vithrani lead was Ambassador Kesavarthen. Yes, 3 weeks in the working antechamber. Same room most of the working day. Parathul turned and looked at Kesavarthen, across the room. Kesavarthen was already looking at Parathul. I had seen Kesavarthen in a great many situations over 12 years. I had seen them under pressure, in genuine uncertainty, in the careful controlled performance of diplomatic confidence when the underlying position was weaker than the surface suggested. The expression Kesavarthen was wearing now, looking at Parath Sul, was none of those. It was the expression of someone who has carried a piece of information for a long time and has now watched it find its way to the right recipient, and who has decided in this moment that they are not going to intervene. Kesavarthen is apex gassed, Parath Sul said, still looking across the room. Senior classification. I know, I said. The senior apex gassed classification is defined by primary recognition capacity, the instinctive biological registration of other apex class organisms. A pause. Kesavarthen knew. Apparently. 3 weeks in the same room. Apparently. And entered no notation in the 4th compact framework record. I couldn't speak to the Vithrani record, I said. That's an internal matter. Parath Sul turned back to me. There was something in the expression that I did not have precise vocabulary for, something that sat between professional reassessment and the much older thing underneath it, the thing that the Vithrani have in common with most species that have survived long enough to develop spaceflight, which is that some information lands not as a thought but as a reorientation. The break timer was almost elapsed. I gathered my notes. Thank you for the information, Parath Sul, I said. Shall we resume? We resumed. What followed in the next 46 minutes was not the negotiation I had prepared for. It was not, I suspected, the negotiation Kesavarthen had brought to the station either. The Vithrani positional framework, assembled over what I estimated as 2 to 3 years of preparation, was thorough, competitive, and built on solid factual ground. It had been designed, as all Vithrani frameworks are designed, to establish positions from which meaningful concession is structurally difficult. You do not simply decide to not use a framework like that. You need a reason that outweighs years of preparation and the institutional expectation of winning. Kesavarthen did not use it. The first indication was the secondary framing on the navigational rights claim. In the morning session, Kesavarthen had constructed framing that placed the Vithrani survey date as the authoritative baseline. In the post-break session, without comment or acknowledgement, the framing shifted. Both survey dates were placed in parallel. That is, in Vithrani negotiating grammar, not neutrality. It is a signal that the party is prepared to treat both records as equivalent starting points, which means they are stepping back from the harder position without marking the step. I noted it. I did not react. Reacting to a Vithrani step back is as much a mistake as reacting to a Vithrani advance. The second indication came on resource rights. The Vithrani resource rights position was the heaviest component of their brief: 3 legal instruments, 2 operational precedents, a recent survey that was genuinely difficult to argue against on its merits. In the morning session, Kesavarthen had signaled this as the primary contested domain, the ground they intended to hold. In the post-break session, they did not raise it. Torvin slid me a note, resource brief. They haven't touched it. I wrote back, I know. He wrote, this isn't normal. I wrote, no. He wrote, what do we do? I wrote, nothing. Keep your face on the documents. He kept his face on the documents. The third indication was the significant one. Near the end of the session, on the question of the Kelvarath's nominal corridor rights, the question whose real content was which party the Kelvarath representative would align with a Kesavarthen, did something I had never seen in 12 years of watching them negotiate. They asked Advisor Oreth directly what the Kelvarath preferred. No framing, no setup, no Vithrani positional structure at all, just a plain declarative question from a negotiator who had, in my experience, never asked a question they did not already know the intended answer to. Advisor Oreth looked at Kesavarthen, looked at me, looked at Miso, who was asleep at the center of the table with his chin on his paws and had no opinion about any of this. Then Oreth said, in the careful formal Kelvarath register that their representatives use when they are saying something they want on record without ambiguity. that the Kelverath preferred the compact's proposed framework, with minor adjustments to the transit allocation schedule that had been noted in the preparatory exchange. Kesavar then said that the Vithrani could accept that. I held my expression. It required some effort. Torvin held his with the rigid control of a man who understood that whatever was happening in this room, his job right now was to stay very still and not cause any additional variables. The treaty terms were set in the subsequent 12 minutes. They were, on balance, as favorable to the compact as the optimistic scenario I had prepared and not shared with my director, because I had not believed it was achievable. At 11:51, Kesavar then said, "The Vithrani delegation considers the precession complete, and the framework agreed for formal drafting." I said, "The compact concurs. We will prepare the drafting instruments for review at 900 tomorrow." Advisor Orath, on behalf of the Kelverath, said this was acceptable and that the Kelverath looked forward to the formal signing. Miso was asleep on the treaty summary. He had migrated from the table's center during the final exchange and settled on the shared document my team had prepared, the one with the compact's preferred terms laid out in full. He was fully asleep now in the deep mode, the slow breathing, the occasional small paw flex, the complete and unqualified indifference to the room. The Vithrani delegation rose. Kesavar then stopped at the door. "Liaison Veth," Kesavar then said. "Ambassador Kesavar then." The pause, the particular kind, not the calculating one. I had heard it from Kesavar then twice in 12 years. Once at the end of a very long framework session when they had said that my counterproposal on the Eastern Transit Clause had been, in the Vithrani word, precisely correct. Once when I had told them, in a difficult meeting about a compact security incident in Vithrani space, that I could not give them the answer they wanted but could give them the accurate one. Both times the pause had come before something that meant, in Vithrani terms, that I was being addressed as a peer rather than a counterpart. "The animal," Kesavar then said, "Miso." "Yes. You have had him for 9 years. 9 years. He was present at the 4th Compact Framework Sessions. He was 3 weeks in the working antechamber." Kesavar then looked at Miso. He was asleep. He was at this moment making the engine room sound. "I noted his presence on the first day," Kesavar then said. "I chose not to document it. The available categories were not adequate to the observation. I considered this an error in the categories, not in the decision to defer." I thought about Kesavar then walking into the 4th Compact Framework antechamber and pausing at the door 12 years ago. I had attributed it to something in the room's layout. I had not thought about it again. "I have occasionally wondered," Kesavar then said, "what the correct record would have looked like." "What did you conclude?" I asked. "That the record was not the problem. The record's limitations were." Kesavar then looked at Miso one more time. Whatever was in that look, I did not have the vocabulary for it. Not reverence. The Vithrani reverence expression is specific and formalized. Something older. The kind of recognition that goes in both directions and does not require a common language. "He will be at the formal drafting sessions?" Kesavar then asked. "Almost certainly. He'll be where the light is." "Very well. The Vithrani inclination that means acknowledgement, or the close of a thing that does not need more words." They left. Torvin and I sat in the antechamber after the delegation had gone. I did not know what to do with my hands for about 30 seconds. Then I picked up the cold coffee cup from the morning, found it still slightly warm, and finished it. "What just happened?" Torvin said. "We concluded the precession." Torvin looked at me with the expression of a second-year attaché who has just watched something that he is going to spend the rest of his career trying to understand, and who knows it. "The resource brief," he said. "They didn't use it. 3 years of preparation, they didn't touch it." "No." He looked at Miso, "because of the cat." I don't know, I said. Not entirely. What do you mean, not entirely? I thought about how to say it with precision. Causation in diplomacy is rarely singular, and misattributing cause is how you build the wrong model for the next negotiation. Something changed when Parathsul ran the instrument and then spoke to Kesavarthin during the break, I said. Or when Kesavarthin understood what Parathsul had found. Something in that conversation changed what Kesavarthin thought the room was. I considered my notes. The Vithrani build their framework on a threat model, a full assessment of the other party's capabilities, position, likely responses under pressure, and what they would be willing to lose. The framework is built on that model. When the model changes, the framework is no longer the accurate tool. And Kesavarthin does not use an inaccurate tool when they have the option to set it aside. The threat model changed, Torvin said. The capability assessment changed, which changed the model, which made the framework the resource brief, the hard positional holds, the full aggressive architecture, into the wrong instrument for the room. Torvin thought about this, because of a cat sleeping on the treaty table. Because the cat on the treaty table is a 9-year-old tabby house cat who has never hunted anything and eats twice a day from a measured portion, I said, whose biological signature registers above the ceiling of the Vithrani apex classification instrument, in a relaxed state, while asleep. We both looked at Miso. He had not moved. Do you think, Torvin said carefully, that anyone in the Compact's diplomatic division has accounted for this, formally? The file notation says travels with cat. There's no flag, no security annotation, no separate clearance. He's been on the manifest at 47 postings across 6 accords. Because to us, Torvin said, he's just a cat. He's just a cat, I said. That's also the accurate statement. Both things are true. Torvin sat with that for a moment. He was quiet in the way of someone who has reached a conclusion and is now measuring whether to say it out loud or keep it as a private working theory. I am going to think about this for a long time, Torvin said. Probably, I said. The Vithrani have 67 species in their primary contact record. They have 147 bilateral negotiations. They have developed over 600 years, what is by all accounts the most sophisticated diplomatic threat assessment apparatus of any spacefaring civilization in this sector. They brought an apex reader to a precession. They brought their own instrument suite. They ran readings during the ground of encounter exchange. He paused. And the thing that changed the model was a cat who has been on the Compact manifest, unflagged, for 9 years. Yes, because we classified him correctly. He is a companion animal. That's what the taxonomy says. That's what the behavior says. That's what 9 years of twice-daily feeding and a scratching post says. Yes. The Vithrani instrument doesn't read behavior, Torvin said. No, I said, it doesn't. He thought about this some more. He was a good attaché, methodical, genuinely careful with language, the kind of second year who was going to be very good at this work in another decade. I could see him filing the observation where it needed to go, in the part of the working model that governs how you assess an unfamiliar room, and understanding that the model had just been updated in a way that was going to affect every posting for the rest of his career. The other species, Torvin said, the ones on the contact record, they've all done the same assessment we just watched. They've classified the Earth Diplomatic Corps, run their threat models, decided what the Compact can and can't do. Presumably, how many of those assessments included a scan of the manifest administrative attachments? I looked at the side console, where Parathsul's instrument sat with its indicators still registering above the midpoint. I don't know, I said. Torvin nodded slowly. I'm going to think about that for a long time too, he said. He looked at the instrument Parathsul had left on the side console. They had not retrieved it when the break ended, and no one had mentioned it for the remainder of the session. The indicators were lower now than they had been at midday, with Miso farther from the unit, but still clearly above the midpoint. "The report," Torvin said. "We write an accurate report," the pre-session concluded. The Vithrani delegation accepted the parallel survey date framing, agreed to the Kelvarath's stated preferences, set the resource rights framework aside for the formal drafting phase. Terms as noted. Session completed in the fastest recorded time for a Vithrani pre-negotiation at this classification. And the reason? The negotiating environment was productive, and both delegations demonstrated flexibility consistent with a good faith settlement framework. I picked up the summary document from the table. Miso adjusted without waking, shifting his chin from the document to the table surface. The administrative section will note, as it always does, that I was accompanied by my registered companion animal, Miso, as documented in the station manifest. Torvin stared at me. "That's it. That's it. Parathsul is going to write a report." "Parathsul is going to write a report," I said, "and Kesavarthen is going to review it before it enters the Vithrani record, and Kesavarthen is going to decide what the available categories are adequate to record." I looked at the door. In my experience, Kesavarthen is thorough about that kind of decision and takes the time to get it right. Torvin considered this. He picked up Parathsul's forgotten instrument and placed it carefully in the center of the table where it would be found easily in the morning. He looked at it, then at Miso. "He's going to sleep through the formal drafting too," Torvin said. "Almost certainly. Both days. Probably he'll be where the light is." Torvin nodded in the way of a man who has decided that certain things about the world are simply facts of life and do not require further analysis. He packed his notes. I packed mine. Miso did not pack anything. He remained exactly where he was until I collected him at 1800 for his second meal, at which point he walked to the carrier, entered it of his own accord, and indicated by his manner that the day had been acceptable. The formal drafting session ran for 2 days. On the first day, Miso spent the morning under my chair and the afternoon against the warm cable housing of the side console. On the second day, he found the treaty table from mid-morning and held the south end for the remainder of the session. The Vithrani document aides, without being asked and without anyone commenting on it, began routing their working copies to the north half of the table. I did not comment on this. Parathsul attended both drafting days. The Apex Reader's instrument was present both days. I did not see it produced during sessions, but on the morning of the second day I arrived early and found Parathsul standing at the empty table, instrument in hand, running a reading on the surface in the section where Miso typically settled. I said good morning. Parathsul said good morning. I asked if there was anything in the reading that required discussion. Parathsul said after a moment that the ambient thermal signature was elevated in that section of the table. That was all. I said I understood. Parathsul put the instrument away. At one point during the second drafting day, during a recess while the document aides were reconciling a transit scheduling table, Parathsul came to stand beside me at the side console and said, without preamble, "I have been an Apex Reader for 22 years. I have registered organisms across 19 species classifications. I have never had an instrument exceed its calibration ceiling during a reading. Prior to this assignment." "I see," I said. "I have submitted a notation request to the Vithrani Instrument Standards Office," Parathsul said. "The request asks whether a new calibration tier is warranted for future use in compact diplomatic settings." A pause. "I wanted you to know that the notation does not include this session's location, the subject of the negotiations, or the name of the compact representative." "Thank you," I said. Parathsul inclined their head and returned to the document review. I thought about this for a moment, and then returned to the transit scheduling table, which was where my attention was supposed to be. The new calibration tier, if the office approved it, would be called whatever the Vithrani Instrument Standards Office decided to call it. The Kelvarath had a name for the category already, 400 years old, apparently. The quiet ones who were already here. Advisor Orath, on the afternoon of the second day, waited until the document aides had stepped out for a copying task, and then said quietly to me, "The Kelvarath have a record notation for animals of this type. The designation is old, older than the contact record. We do not use it often." A pause. "We used it for the last organism we encountered that registered on our own instruments this way. That was 400 years ago." The organism in question was not what we had initially assumed it to be. I said, "What did you call them?" Orath looked at Miso, who was asleep on the table with his paw extended. "The word translates approximately as the quiet ones who were already here." Another pause. "We consider it a mark of distinction, not a classification." "I'll tell him," I said. Orath's 4 eyes arranged themselves in what I had learned was the Kelvarath equivalent of a quiet smile. "He already knows," Orath said, and returned to the documents. The terms were finalized that afternoon. Advisor Orath signed for the Kelvarath at 1640. The compact signature followed. Kesavarthen signed for the Vithrani at 1642. At the conclusion of the signing, Kesavarthen walked to the south end of the table and stood looking at Miso. Miso looked back with the mild gaze he uses for humans who are not going to feed him. Miso blinked, the slow, deliberate blink both eyes to a squint reopening. Kesavarthen held out the primary hand, palm side neutral, approximately 10 centimeters from Miso's face. A formal Vithrani gesture. Miso sniffed the hand, then pressed the side of his jaw against Kesavarthen's fingers. I had seen him do that with the maintenance chief on the Vorath posting, who had brought him a piece of protein every morning for 6 weeks. I had seen him do it with Torvin, on day 4 of the Solen posting, after Torvin had been still long enough at the side console to meet Miso's requirements for trustworthy. I had not thought, before this moment, to consider what Vithrani apex gas made of it. Kesavarthen held very still for a moment, then slowly lowered the hand. "Liaison Veth," Kesavarthen said. "Ambassador. Thank you for a productive session." "Thank you," I said. "Safe travels." They went to the door, paused. "The compact's position on the Eastern Transit Clause," Kesavarthen said, "was precisely correct." Then they left. I filed the report that evening at 21:10. I wrote it accurately. I noted the ground of encounter exchange, the framing revisions, the resource rights adjustment, the final terms and their distribution. I noted the session duration. I noted the outcome as favorable to the compact's primary objectives. I noted Advisor Orath's role and the Kelvarath's alignment. In the administrative section, I noted that I had been accompanied throughout by my registered companion animal, as per the station manifest. There was one other thing on my desk. Before the delegation had left for the final time, Parath Sul had come to the table and placed the instrument unit in front of me, not as a gift and not as a threat, more as a transfer of record. The data transcript that Torvin had copied on day 1 of the drafting session was on a separate chip beside it. Parath Sul had said nothing when leaving the instrument. I had not asked. I looked at the transcript now. The data was the same as it had been when Parath Sul showed me the original reading during the break. The ceiling indicator, the auto-adjusted scale, the secondary marker showing the upward calibration shift. Above Tier 1. Still above Tier 1. I thought about the 47 postings, the 6 accords, the Vorath bilateral, where the other party's observers had commented on the cat in Liaison Veth's carrier and I had said yes, he travels with me, and no one had asked anything further. The 4th compact framework, where Kesavarthen had walked through the door on day 1 and paused for 2 seconds, and I had attributed it to the room layout. 12 years of negotiations, 47 manifest entries, and the note in the compact's file that said travels with cat, because that was what he was, and it was accurate, and accuracy was the foundation of the record. I thought about all the other postings by all the other liaisons and envoys and team leads across the compact's diplomatic corps. The ones who also traveled with cats, or with dogs, or with the hamster someone had mentioned at a division meeting once, kept in a cage on the transit ship and listed under personal effects because that was the correct category. The ones who had sat across tables from Vithrani delegations and Kelvarath representatives, and whoever else, with a carrier under the desk or a pet asleep in the corner. And none of those assessments had included whatever Parath Sul had done in this room. The Kelvarath notation was 400 years old. The last organism it had applied to was not what they initially assumed it to be, Oreth had said. I had not asked what it was. I had the feeling, thinking about it now, that the answer was probably not dramatic, not a war, not a crisis, not some ancient confrontation between civilizations. Probably something quiet, something that had arrived in a room and sat down and been itself, and the Kelvarath had looked at their instruments and then at the thing and then at their instruments again and said, "This category does not cover what we are seeing. We need a new one. We will call it the quiet ones who were already here." 400 years. And then Miso walked across a treaty table and reached Station Solen, and the same thing happened again, in a different room, with different instruments, in a different language. My director responded at 22:47. "Outstanding. Debrief when you're back. I've never seen a Vithrani set aside a resource brief mid-session in the full contact record." I wrote back, happy to debrief. It was a productive environment. He wrote what changed. I looked at Miso on the bunk. He was in the compact position he uses at the end of a day, chin on paws, eyes at half-mast, the cabin quiet around him. Outside the observation port, the station's running lights made a pale line against the dark. In a few minutes he would be fully under, the way he always goes fully under, completely, without reservation, with no apparent awareness that something had happened in the rooms around him across the past 2 days that would take the diplomatic corps a long time to fully account for. He had, in 2 days at Reach Station Solen, been present while the Vithrani delegation set aside a 3-year resource rights framework without explanation, concluded the fastest pre-negotiation in the contact record, and been endorsed, in the Kelvarath's old notation, as one of the quiet ones who were already here. He had eaten his meals, he had found the light, he had slept on treaty documents. I wrote back to my director. The negotiating environment was receptive to an accurate assessment of the compact's position and capabilities. He wrote, "That's not an answer." I wrote, "It's an accurate one." He did not respond. I took that to mean he would press the point in the debrief. He could press it. I would tell him about the productive session and the good faith framework and the shared survey protocol. I would note in the standard section that Miso had been present. The rest was in the record, such as the record was, and in Parath Sul's report, which Kesavathan would read and decide about, and in the Kelvarath notation that had not been used in 400 years, and in the instrument transcript on my desk, and in the indent a warm orange cat had left in the Vithrani's prepared position document on the morning of the first day, which I had not mentioned in the report because it was not, strictly speaking, a material development. Miso made the engine room sound. His paw extended once and retracted. I turned off the console and went to sleep.